Pope Francis arrives in France today, visiting Marseille to show solidarity with the plight of migrants there. It comes a decade on from a landmark visit to Lampedusa at the start of his papacy, where he condemned the global indifference to their suffering. He's travelled to many migration hotspots in that time. Harsh words he's had for European leaders who, he said, live in a bubble, and Europeans too, in a culture of prosperity that makes them apathetic. Well, to today's perspective, we're going to look at whether the words, the efforts of Pope Francis has made any difference to those in power. Camille Le Coz is a senior policy analyst at the Migration Policy Institute think tank. Well, let's start with that harsh criticism. Back in 2013, I think Pope Francis was probably about 2-3 months into his role, becoming Pope, where he talked about, this indifference. Do you see that in his social commentary? Does he listen to? Does it fall on deaf ears?
Yeah, I think what we've seen in a way is a radicalization of the position on migration. On the one hand, part of the EU, part of the European have shown solidarity, have shown they're ready to welcome migrants. We've seen it with Ukrainian. And on the other end, I think we're seeing, and this is part of the Catholic population also, that is increasingly critical of the Pope and of, these forces that are showing solidarity with migrants, saying, Europe, we need to protect our values and we need to build higher walls to prevent migrants from coming.
I remember back in 2016, I was in Lesbos when the Pope Francis arrived. He made quite an incredible move, actually. He decided to take a number of Syrian migrants back on his plane to the Vatican to say, look, everybody can do their bit. And on the other side of that, I think we've had in the last few days right-wing politicians at the Rassemblement National here in France saying, of Marine Le Pen's party, this is a man who's now playing politician too much. He's interfering. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think we're seeing also the far right, really using this topic and distanciating themselves from this type of position, from this, idea of solidarity, ideas that showing that we can host migrants. And I think what's been interesting with the far right, it's like increasingly this view that we're closing ourselves to the word, like we're not, and I think that's where the Pope has a distinct position, because he's really one Pope for the word and speaking to a much wider audience than this European one. Whereas politicians in Italy and I would say even more in France are speaking to their French audience, are speaking to, the French people and saying we need to protect our border, we need to preserve these French values that we see being put at risk by the presence of these people.
It's a very good point, because if you look at the Pope's next-door neighbour from the Vatican to in Italy, and the situation with Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister, taking a very hard, right-wing stance, saying that actually she wants an effective blockade of the boats coming from Tunisia, mainly at the moment. And then you have a meeting that's going to happen tomorrow with President Macron, who's also veered to the right.
Yeah, I think what's been interesting with Giorgia Meloni is on the one hand, this discourse that seems very radical, this idea of organizing a blockade, but it hasn't happened in practice. And I think it's been a little bit of a reality test that you can say these things, you can say we don't want anyone to arrive, but then there is a reality that people are going to keep coming. And I think this is where maybe the influence of the church comes a little bit, because you have people, and we've seen it in Lampedusa, when people have arrived, who are mobilizing, who are helping when people land in disastrous, in very, very difficult condition. So in a way, I think we're seeing this reality test and this idea that we need to organize. And this is where solidarity comes back again, because I think at EU level, European Union level, we need to show solidarity with Italy when this type of events happen.
If you were part of the Pope's team, his inner circle, advising him and trying to work out what success he's had in this message, making it a central part of his campaign as Pope, the Migrants Pope, many called him, over this 10-year period, how much of a success do you think that you would think he'd had?
Yeah, I would say it's limited. I think he's been part of a messaging, and I think there are different arguments that are trying to stay, to change this narrative on migration, that migrants are dangerous, that they're putting our identity at risk. I think he's plays part, but indeed, like we're seeing his authority, his message kind of decreasing in impact, and yes, him not being listened to.
Marseille, choosing the oldest city in France, old crossroads for trade, for migration for centuries. Give us a sense of why he's chosen that. Yeah,
it's a very symbolic city. It's a city that embodies the diversity of France. I think we've also seen Marseille as a mayor that is very, has established himself as being pro-migrant, pro-migration. So this is also quite a political choice. And so I think in that sense, I think he's part of the figures that are trying to reframe the narrative around migration in Europe. I think we've seen with the Ukraine crisis how, when you change the narrative, when you play on symbols, you can make people understand that we can manage this migration crisis. So I think that's the role he's trying to play, going to Marseille and trying to show, the benefits of diversity for a city like Marseille.
It's an interesting point you made a moment ago, saying potentially limited success in terms of any persuasion towards world leaders giving the direction, particularly in Europe at the moment, that more right-wing potentially governments coming in. We've got elections coming up in Slovenia. We've also got elections in Poland.
In Germany as well.
And Germany as well. So harder anti-migration messages we're hearing, particularly on the hard right. But at the same time, we're talking about it now. It'll be in the papers tomorrow. He usually does something that people remember. I mentioned in Lesbos taking the migrants or holding mass with migrants. So is there a soft power there as well that gets attention?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think we need this argument. We need to show that there is a narrative that can be different. And again, I'm sorry, but I'm coming back to Ukraine. It's like Ukraine, there's 6 million Ukrainian refugees. Europe has shown that we could host these people. It requires mobilization from government, from civil society, from everyone, communities. But this is something we can do, and I think this is all about narrative. That in the case of of Lampedusa, we know this type of event are gonna happen over and over again. And so what we need to do really is organize ourselves so that when this happens, there is reception condition, there is a system on the ground that allows for people to be taken care of.
It's a good point. And also the sense that when you deal with it en masse as a term, migrants, migration, it's often a term that you can feel alien to. And I think just from my previous experience following the Pope's trips around Europe to try and highlight this message, the sense that it's moments you pick up. Everybody remembers the Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old boy found dead in the waters off the coast of Turkey.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing how these messages are becoming increasingly difficult to convey. We've seen a lot of other horrifying images, in the past few years, and they're not striking a chord as that image had. And so I think it's also for the Pope, for journalists. There's a bit of a brutalization of the minds. I think we're getting used to these narratives. And I think it's why it's important to keep trying to strike that chord, but also to play on other front. Like, we know there's an economic argument for, migration, organized migration. There's a demographic one for Europe as well. And so I think it's really important we try to shift and bring, this reality to the public. Instead of conveying this information, this misinformation of the fact that we can close border and we're going to be all, right behind your walls.
Are there things that you see as moments to watch on this trip to Marseille, these 3 days coming up?
I think the encounter with President Macron, is going to be an interesting one because I think there are two topics that are high on the agenda of the Pope. One is climate, one is migration. And these two really very much intersect, because what worries me a little bit when we see, this discourse in Europe is we're not paying sufficient attention on the impact of climate change. We're seeing it already in Europe. But what we really need to be preparing ourselves for is helping countries in the south that are going to be primarily affected by climate change to adapt to this effect. And this is going to require massive investment. And I think we need to be there to support this country. And we're not seeing this engagement at the moment.
One brief last question. Just how do you sense the media coverage is at the moment around this and how that influences the debate?
It's always very sensitive in France, given the fraught relationship we have with religion, with the church. And so I think there's been a lot of focus on whether President Macron was attending Mass or not. I think let's see how, the coverage of these more political messages that the Pope is bringing will take place.
Camille Le Coz, great to talk to you. A senior policy analyst at the think tank Migration Policy Institute. Our guest on today's Perspective.